Every morning before the sun stretched across the quiet streets of Fairbridge, there was already one figure out and about. The old man with the broom. He wore the same worn brown jacket, a faded navy cap pulled low over his eyes, and black shoes that had clearly seen decades of steps. No one really knew his name. To most people in town, he was just the volunteer, the man who swept the sidewalks, picked up trash from gutters, and cleared leaves from bus stops. Some assumed he worked for the city, others thought he might be homeless. But no one asked. He never spoke much, never lingered long, just nodded politely when someone said hello, then quietly returned to his work. People appreciated him, sure, but in that distant, passing way, people appreciate things they take for granted. Teenagers joked about him. Children were told to stay polite, and adults would glance and then continue scrolling on their phones. But there he was, every single morning, before businesses opened or school bells rang, with his old broom and slow, deliberate movements. His name was Walter Hayes, though no one called him that anymore. Decades ago, he'd worn a different uniform, combat boots instead of work shoes, a rifle instead of a broom. Walter had been a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division. He'd seen war up close, too close. He'd buried friends, survived ambushes, and carried the weight of things most people couldn't imagine. But after the war, he didn't want glory. He didn't want speeches or medals. He wanted quiet. He wanted purpose without attention. So, he chose to give back in silence, to serve his town the only way he knew how, by keeping it clean. His small apartment overlooked the main street. He kept the walls bare except for one faded photo. His unit lined up in the desert sun, smiling despite the heat and dust. One morning, while sweeping near the school, Walter noticed a crumpled notebook on the sidewalk. He bent slowly to pick it up, dusted it off, and saw a name written on the cover, Aiden J. Rowe, senior year. He hesitated, then walked to the school office and handed it in. He didn't expect anything in return, but that moment would trigger something he never saw coming. Aiden Rowe was 17, tall and sharp with a mop of dark hair and earbuds that never left his ears. He wasn't a bad kid, just distracted like most teens. He passed the old man nearly every morning, but had never really looked at him, just another figure in the background. That afternoon, Aiden was surprised to find his notebook returned to him by the front desk secretary. Some gentleman dropped it off, she said. Didn't leave a name. Aiden opened it and saw a post-it on the front page that read simply, "Try not to lose this, W." That was odd. Who was W? Aiden walked outside, curious, and spotted the old man sweeping near the bike racks. Something about the posture, the calm rhythm, the gentleness of his movements struck him differently now. Later that week, after practice, Aiden saw the old man again, this time crouched near the park fountain, scrubbing graffiti off the stone. He approached and said, "Hey, are you the guy who found my notebook?" Walter looked up, blinked slowly, and nodded. "Thought you might need it," he said. Aiden smiled awkwardly. "Thanks. That was cool of you." Walter just shrugged. People lose things. Happens. It was a simple exchange, but for some reason, Aiden didn't leave right away. "You do this every day?" he asked. "Pretty much," Walter replied, standing slowly. "Somebody's got to do it." Aiden watched him for a second. "You work for the city?" "Nope," Walter said. "Just a habit." The way he said it made Aiden pause. There was weight in those two words. A habit. Not just routine, but ritual. Like this meant something more. Aiden nodded and left, but he kept thinking about the man. A few days later, during a school history project, Aiden stumbled on a story in an old town newspaper archive. It was about a local war hero named Walter Hayes, who had saved several men in a surprise ambush overseas decades ago. There was even a picture, grainy but clear enough. The same eyes, same jawline. The man with the broom. Shocked, Aiden dug deeper. More articles, more photos, medals awarded. A quote from a general. "Sergeant Hayes represents the quiet kind of heroism we should all aspire to." The name burned into his brain. Why didn't anyone in town know? Why wasn't this common knowledge? The man who silently cleaned their streets had once saved lives under gunfire. That night, Aiden lay awake thinking. The next morning, he made sure to leave early. He found Walter by the courthouse steps, sweeping up cigarette butts. "You're Sergeant Hayes," Aiden blurted. Walter paused. "Used to be," he said. "How did you, I read about you. You were a hero." Walter's expression hardened slightly. "That was a long time ago." Aiden didn't know what to say. "Why don't people know?" he asked. Walter gave a faint smile. "Not the kind of thing you need to talk about. Streets still get dirty." Aiden stood there in silence, feeling small. Then he asked, "Can I help?" Walter looked at him, surprised. "With what?" "I don't know. Sweeping, maybe. I got time before school." Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded once and handed him a second broom. And for the first time in years, Walter didn't sweep alone.
For the next few mornings, Aiden showed up early with his backpack slung over one shoulder and a quiet determination in his walk as he joined Walter in his routine. They didn't talk much at first, just swept side by side, one with practiced grace, the other clumsier, but learning, and somehow the silence felt full, not empty. There was something steady and grounding in the rhythm of it, the way the broom bristled against pavement, the soft scrape of debris gathered into piles, the sunrise warming the rooftops. Walter didn't say much, but he watched Aiden carefully, noting how the boy glanced around at the world. More now how he picked up things without being told, how he asked questions, not just out of curiosity, but respect. One morning after they finished, Walter sat on the courthouse steps, and Aiden joined him, breathing hard from chasing a rolling soda can halfway down the block. Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out an old silver lighter. He turned it over in his palm a few times, then handed it to Aiden, who stared at it, confused. It was dented, scuffed, the initials WH etched into one side, and beneath them a faint crest with wings and stars I carried that through the desert. Walter said softly, "Found it in a care package from home, figured it was too nice to lose, but too meaningful not to use." Aiden turned it over slowly. It felt heavy. Despite its size that day, they didn't sweep much. Instead, they sat and Walter told him about the people he served with, the long, hot days, the longer nights, the way silence could be louder than gunfire, and how, when he got home, it was all too quiet in a different way. He talked about how he'd tried to work in a warehouse for a while, how the noise felt wrong, how people wanted to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. So he started walking, just walking, until one day he picked up a piece of trash, without thinking then, another and another, until it became something like purpose. Aiden listened without interrupting, the words settling into him like seeds in soil. Something in him shifted that day when he got to school. He looked at the janitor differently, said, "Thank you," when he hadn't. Before he picked up a cup, someone else had dropped and tossed it in the bin. When his friends asked what he was doing, he shrugged and said, "Just helping." The next morning, Aiden brought coffee for Walter, who took it with a grateful nod. "Not much for fancy things," he said, "but warmth is warmth." They sat on the curb, sipping slowly, watching the town wake up. Aiden asked him about the war again, not the politics or battles, but the people. The ones he remembered. Walter spoke of a friend named Marcus, who wrote poems in a battered notebook, of another named Sal, who made everyone laugh, even in the worst moments, of a medic who never stopped moving, a captain who never raised his voice, and how each of them left pieces behind, pieces Walter still carried. Aiden didn't pretend to understand, but he listened, and Walter noticed that too. One morning, Walter didn't show up. Aidan waited by the bike racks, broom in hand. 15 minutes passed. Then 20, he felt uneasy, and walked to the usual corners, but the sidewalks were untouched. No familiar jacket, no quiet nod. He called the school, said he'd be late, and walked across town to the small brick apartment building Walter had once mentioned. The landlady, an older woman with thick glasses, answered, and when Aidan asked, she hesitated, then said flatly, "He's in the hospital." Aidan's stomach dropped. He rushed there, heart pounding, and found Walter in a small room, eyes closed, machines beeping soft and steady. The nurse said he'd collapsed from exhaustion, maybe dehydration, and maybe he'd just pushed too hard too long. Aidan sat beside him for hours, watching the man who had once jumped out of planes now lie still and fragile. When Walter opened his eyes late in the day, he looked surprised to see him. "You're supposed to be in school," he croaked, and Aidan laughed, but it caught in his throat. "Yeah, well, someone had to make sure the streets didn't fall apart without you." Walter smiled weakly. "That's good. Someone should." And in that moment, Aidan realized that this wasn't just about sweeping or volunteering. It was about memory, legacy, and connection. He squeezed Walter's hand gently and said, "I'll keep it going till you're back, I promise." And Walter nodded just once, but that was enough. Walter eventually recovered and returned home with the quiet stubbornness that defined him. But things weren't quite the same. His pace was slower, his hands a bit shakier, and though he still swept the streets each morning, the energy behind each motion had changed. Aidan continued to join him each day now, not just as a helper, but as something closer to a partner. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't, but the bond between them had solidified into something neither fully understood, but both respected. One morning, Walter handed Aidan an envelope. It was thin and plain, with only the boy's name written in neat cursive. Aidan opened it later at home, and inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a key. The note read, "These are the shoes I wore on my last patrol. I've kept them because they reminded me who I am now. They belong to someone who reminded me who I was. Keep walking where others won't." Aidan stared at the page for a long time. The next morning, he didn't see Walter on the usual corner, or at the courthouse, or anywhere in town. His apartment was empty. The landlady said he'd packed up quietly and left no forwarding address, just said it was time Aidan felt the absence like a hole in the rhythm of the city. But he didn't stop sweeping. He showed up every morning, broom in hand, following the same route Walter once did. At first, people gave him odd looks, but gradually they began to recognize what he was doing. Shop owners started leaving out water bottles for him. Kids waved, bus drivers honked and nodded, and sometimes someone would join for a few minutes. A mother walking her child, a jogger passing by, and every time he passed the small bronze plaque downtown with Walter's name quietly engraved beneath a short inscription, "Served in silence, lived with honor," he would tap it gently and keep moving. Months passed, then a year, and Aidan found himself growing into something steadier, more grounded. He spoke differently, listened, more helped, without being asked. He started volunteering in other ways, too, mentoring kids, cleaning up parks. And in time, others joined regularly. The town began to change, not in huge, flashy ways, but in subtle, beautiful ones. People paid more attention to their surroundings, picked up trash, planted flowers, painted fences. It was as if Walter's quiet service had awakened something in them all. One day, an older man in a crisp suit approached Aidan while he was sweeping and introduced himself as a journalist. He'd been tracing stories of veterans living under the radar and had heard whispers of the man with the broom and the boy who followed his path. He asked Aidan if he'd do an interview. Aidan hesitated, then said only if it's about him, not me. The man nodded and promised to honor that. A few weeks later, an article appeared online titled "The Volunteer's Shoes." It spoke of Walter's military service, his silent dedication to the town, and the ripple effect of one man's quiet kindness. It ended with a photo of a pair of worn black shoes, neatly placed beside a broom leaning against a wall. No name, no face, just legacy. Some said they saw Walter once more years later, walking along a distant beach with the wind in his hair and a peace in his stride. Others believed he had simply disappeared into the world the way he'd lived gently and without demand. But every year on the day of his departure, Aidan would place those shoes on the courthouse steps. Just as the sun rose, he would stand beside them in silence for a moment of gratitude, then lift his broom and begin again. Because some people don't need statues or speeches to be remembered. They just need someone to keep walking in their shoes.